So whilst that's obviously very much the talked about part of the code, interestingly, it's what they're calling the civil penalties are far more likely to be of interest to us, as they allow the ACCC to issue penalties to the retailers without going to court. And that could give the ACCC a lot of room to be able to express their opinion on things in the code, whereas historically they couldn't.
Welcome back to the Vegalogue podcast, a dialogue about the Australian vegetable industry from AUSVEG. I'm Alex Lashchuk. In this two-part episode, we delve into Australia's evolving food and grocery sector. With the new mandatory Food and Grocery Code of Conduct due to commence on the 1st of April 2025, and the ACCC Supermarket Inquiry due to report at the end of February, there continues to be significant conversations about the power dynamics and fairness of the Australian grocery sector. Our guest, Neil Rechlin, director of NextGen Group, brings over 20 years of experience in developing category and capability solutions. Neil is deeply involved in the evolution of the Food and Grocery Code of Conduct, working with manufacturers, industry bodies, and the ACCC to ensure its continued progress. Join us as Neil shares his perspective on the impact of the current changes, what to watch for as the new code takes effect, and what measures he thinks should still come to improve the grower-retailer relationship. Well, good afternoon, Neil, and welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having me, Alex. Pleased to be here.
It is just over 12 months ago when the first supermarket inquiry was announced, the Senate inquiry, and since we have also had the review of the Food and Grocery Code and the current ACCC review into supermarkets, what are your impressions of the last 12 months?
I think it's really been a 12 months like we have never seen before. We've had, at last count, I've lost count, it's something like 9, 10 or 11 different inquiries now, depending on what you deem to be an inquiry, a Senate inquiry, an ACCC inquiry, a review of legislation, changes to legislation. I don't think there's been a period, certainly in my time in this industry, where we've seen that much noise in that shorter period of time. And that obviously provides a quite unique environment in which both the retailers and the suppliers now operate. And the ability to make change in that environment, again, is like we have not seen before. So the pressure on the retailers to consider where they are at and how they are interfacing and interacting both with consumers, shoppers, and then their suppliers, particularly the horticultural sector, is many say it's a once-in-a-generational opportunity for change. And I'd agree with that. The amount of noise, political, social media, consumer noise that we're seeing really is providing an environment in which change can occur, must occur, in a way that, say, hasn't been the case, certainly in the 20 plus years I've been in Australia and working in this sector. I've not seen this type of environment that facilitates the kind of change that we potentially have license to make over the next 12, 24 months.
The new compulsory Food and Grocery Code of Conduct has been released on the 17th of December last year. What do you see as key changes introduced by this code, and what do you think will be the biggest benefits to vegetable producers?
The new code, or version 3 of the code, as we refer to it as we're currently live with version 2, which was the code that was reviewed by Graham Samuel way back when in 2018. It went live in 2020. So the new code, the most talked about piece obviously is that it's going to become mandated, which is a change in the legal framework in which it sits under the ACCC. Interestingly, that in its own right is interesting, but probably not actually going to make that much difference in the way that the code works. It means that they can now be prosecuted by the ACCC for breaches, and the potential fines are very significant. In the previous version of the code, the one that runs up until the end of March, I think the maximum fine was somewhere in the order of $67,000, and the potential fine for version 3 of the code could be up to kind of just shy of $4 billion or 10% of annual turnover of the retailers. Pragmatically and realistically, I don't see that happening. So whilst that's obviously very much the talked about part of the code, interestingly, it's what they're calling the civil penalties are far more likely to be of interest to us, as they allow the ACCC to issue penalties to the retailers without going to court. Now, the retailers can contest those in court, and those civil penalties tend to be in the tens of thousands of dollars, but they are relatively easily applied for what the ACCC would be deemed breaches of the code. So that's a mechanic that isn't available in the current version, but will be available in the version 3 code, and that could give the ACCC a lot of room to be able to express their opinion on things in the code, whereas historically they couldn't. So that's probably the single biggest element that will become a daily consideration for the ACCC, and that's new, and that's I suspect a positive move forward. The impact on horticulture for that is the ability for either growers, farmers, or their representatives, i.e. peak bodies, to engage with the ACCC around behaviours that might be deemed to be inappropriate will be arguably easier, and arguably there'll be an audience that will listen in the ACCC. Prior to that, or prior to 1st of April, you'd have to go on to the independent arbiters, and they'd then conduct an investigation, et cetera, and all of that kind of went into the too hard basket. So from a Hort perspective, I think it does provide an avenue for dialogue between growers and or peak bodies and the ACCC, and as I said previously, the ability then to access civil penalties, whilst in absolute monetary terms not that significant, in terms of kind of PR and media terms, significant ways of waving a stick.
Once the code comes into effect on April 1st, what will we need to watch for over the next 12 months, and when do you think a review should happen?
Starting with the review question, or part of the question there, Alex, the review is actually mandated within the code. So that's not something we have any discretion over. And it is legislated to commence no later than the 1st of April 2027. So, which is a good thing. So it's a 2-year window, which gives us enough time for the new version of the code to bed in, but not so long that problems that might arise through version 3 of the code have a long runway before they can be addressed. So that's a good thing, and certainly an improvement from the original recommendation, and indeed from the previous code, which was a 3-year window. In terms of what we need to watch out for, what is unknown is obviously there's a bunch of political stuff going on with the ACCC prosecution of Woolworths and Coles on their promotional plans. There's the ACCC inquiry on supermarkets. There's Senate inquiries that are handing down findings and so on and so forth. So all of these things are inevitably going to have some kind of impact on the way that retailers think and behave. And the code's just one of those dynamics. And being a mandated code with both the civil penalties as discussed, but also then the ability to take them to court for breaches of the code with very significant fines is inevitably going to change maybe the psyche of the way that the retailers and then the buyers within the retailers think and behave, as a breach is likely to have more and more immediate consequence than it perhaps historically did. So I think we just need to, certainly over the first 12 months, just kind of look at the way that the retailers are engaging with all of those kind of moving parts as I described, and how the buyers in turn are reacting in the way that they engage with growers. So we want to just kind of understand how the behavior changes, if indeed it does change for better or for worse. And I'm not suggesting for 1 minute there's any intention for the behaviors to get worse. They likely will need to just be more conscious of their behaviors, as the consequence is more significant corporately and personally for shortcomings of behavior against code. So it's a watching brief over the first 12 months. But I would also say, Alex, that certainly from our experience, the hort industry has not necessarily been particularly up to speed with the protections that even the existing code offers the horticultural industry. And I think there's a significant amount of work that can be done by growers, with growers, to better understand the rights that they already enjoy under the code, none of which are removed. In fact, they're only strengthened under version 3 of the code. And certainly from our experience of working closely with growers is significant change can be generated through understanding the rules of the road in regard the grocery code when interacting and dealing with a retailer. It's not a perfect tool, but it is a tool that can be used. And when growers have little or poor understanding of those tools, it's just a missed opportunity.
How do you think the compulsory code will influence the power dynamics between major supermarkets and growers?
It's a good question, Alex. And the power dynamic is, in the first instance, shaped by what we'd call scale or power asymmetry. When you're dealing with a $30-40 billion retailer and you're a $5 million grower, by definition, there's already a massive difference in scale. And more often than not, for a lot of growers, the dependence on the retailer, a retailer may be 10, 20, 40, 50, or even 80% of a grower's business, whereas the inverse of that for a retailer, it would not be uncommon for a grower to be, even within the subcategory, maybe 10, 15, 20, 30%. And if that grower were to not exist tomorrow, the retailer would happily continue doing business likely with other people, or instead of selling one variety of potato, they'll be selling another variety or a different onion or a different carrot. They're not as dependent on one grower as the growers are inevitably dependent on the retailer. So there is a fundamental power asymmetry. The code strives to create some guide rails around the way that those interactions work within that asymmetry, preventing poor behavior by buyers, by retailers, and using kind of processes or tactics or behaviors that would fall short of community expectations. And more often than not, buyers are genuinely striving to do the right thing and buy, great produce at great prices and sell them to shoppers. But we do occasionally see behavior that doesn't perhaps meet those expectations that the retailers set. And that's where the code absolutely can help kind of adjust or redirect those conversations between grower and buyer. But as I said previously, unless the buyer knows in the first instance that something is being done or said that perhaps is not in line with the guide rails that are set, then it becomes very difficult to respond in a way if you don't actually know that you're being wronged in the first place.
Do you foresee any shifts in supermarket behavior as a result of the compulsory code?
I would like to see shifts in behavior. I'd like to see some of the potentially unintended kind of breaches or interpretations of the code, perhaps kind of not occurring. I think there will be a greater awareness amongst the retail buying community, as particularly the civil penalties I mentioned come into play. The ability for the ACCC to levy a civil penalty, as they've done in the Horticultural Code of Conduct. In the last 18 months, there have been like 6 or so civil penalties against merchants for breaches of the Hort Code. I would see a similar kind of approach by the ACCC, where they could levy half a dozen civil penalties very quickly and very easily against the major retailers that are subject to the code, and that's something that they will be highly aware of. So I think we'll see a greater caution by buyers because the ability to get into trouble is more obvious than perhaps it was before.
How do you think Australia's new compulsory food and grocery code of conduct compares to similar codes in countries like New Zealand? In your opinion, does it stack up well against international standards, and what items are there in other codes that you would like to see adopted in Australia?
It's a good question. And the first kind of major grocery code was in the UK back in 2009, I think it was. And the Australian code was based loosely on the UK code. And then the New Zealand code, which came into play in 2023, was in large part a cut and paste of the Australian code with some modifications for that market. Version 3 of the code and some of the recommendations actually did look at the New Zealand code to see what perhaps was interesting and working well over there and we could incorporate here. Some of those were recommended and are yet to be fully understood as to whether they'll be implemented. And I think the most interesting one that appears to be working well in New Zealand is the anonymous complaints line. So a supplier, a grower, anybody providing product to the supermarkets can anonymously submit their complaint. And in New Zealand, that goes to the equivalent of the ACCC, and it gives them a really good picture of some of the systemic issues. So they're not actually interested in any one particular supplier, but when 5 suppliers have said, this is happening to me, is it right? And let's assume it's not, then that just becomes a really kind of big red flag for the ACCC then to say, we think there is a systemic issue that needs to be further investigated and looked into. So with a bit of luck, there still is time for that to occur. That would be an area from the New Zealand code that I think would be a really interesting addition, and was Professor Emerson did recommend that. We have to see whether that will come into play through the ACCC. So that would be a good take, if you will, from the New Zealand code, and then there'll likely be a Canadian code as well. We'll see how that plays out over the course of this year, and see whether there's anything we can learn from that. But from ours in New Zealand, very similar. The UK, much more high level. We're kind of a little bit at the bleeding edge, if you will. So there's not a lot of examples around the world where we can say this is the perfect answer. Let's apply it here. We're kind of evolving as we go.
This concludes part 1 of the episode. Stay tuned for part 2 coming next month. You've been listening to the Vegalogue podcast. Don't forget to subscribe and give the podcast a rating and review to help others find us. Vegalogue is produced by AUSVEG, the peak industry body for Australian vegetable, potato and onion growers. You can find more news and information from AUSVEG at ausveg.com.au, on our social media channels, or in the Australian Grower magazine. Thank you for listening.